In the year 2025, deep within climate-controlled archives, researchers began a project once considered redundant. They turned their attention to thousands of Sumerian tablet fragments, pieces of a forgotten world that scholars had long assumed were fully understood. Using new digital imaging techniques, they placed these ceramic shards side by side in a virtual mosaic, hoping to find a few new connections. Instead, they uncovered a silent conspiracy, etched into the very clay of history. A pattern began to emerge, one that defied all conventional explanation. Many of the tablets had not broken from the slow, gentle pressures of time. The safe and convenient theory of natural decay was violently contradicted by the evidence. These fractures were too clean, the patterns too deliberate, the destruction too methodical to be the result of accident alone. To confirm their unsettling suspicions, the team enlisted a new kind of expert, an artificial intelligence system designed for forensic surface analysis. They fed it more than 9,000 fragments, unleashing its microscopic gaze upon every fracture line, every scorch mark, every ancient gouge. The scorch marks were especially damning. Fired clay does not burn on its own, nor does it develop identical heat signatures across disparate fragments, unless subjected to direct, intentional fire. The AI's analysis revealed a brutal, calculated ritual. Someone had heated the clay with methodical control, bringing it to the precise temperature where it would become brittle, before shattering it with targeted force. When the system returned its findings, a chill fell over the research team. A significant number of breaks shared identical impact angles and depths. The burn temperatures were so consistent they could only have come from a repeatable, practiced technique. They were the unmistakable signatures of deliberate hammer strikes, carried out after controlled heating, a combination that left no room for doubt. Someone in the ancient world, across the great cities of Eridu, Nippur, and Uruk, had taken extreme measures to destroy specific knowledge forever. What was this forbidden history? The surviving, untampered texts told of exciting, unsettling stories, narratives of how gods intermingled with mortals and had a direct hand in the very creation of humankind. But the destroyed sections, the AI began to piece together, contained something more. It was a warning. Given unrestricted access to a global library of ancient texts, Sumerian, Egyptian, Vedic, even Hopi, the machine intelligence kept finding the same ghosts in the data, the same erased symbols, the same missing sentences, the same terrifying pattern of redaction. Civilizations that never met, separated by oceans and millennia, were all warning about the same singular event. The AI's final message, compiled from the ghosts of a dozen butchered histories, was blunt, undeniable, and horrifying. The cycle they feared is active again. Then came the coordinates, a location on Earth that matched an ancient prophecy to the last digit. It was a place where tablets that were never meant to be read lay waiting. The first complete translation from this new site returned a line no scholar had ever seen. The researchers froze. The knowledge our ancestors tried to bury was not a history, but a countdown. Their desperate act of destruction was not born of malice, but of a profound and primal fear. A fear of a truth they believed would break the world. A truth that has, perhaps, finally woken up. In the quiet, climate-controlled archives, where the dawn of civilization is preserved on tablets of baked clay, a whisper of unease began to circulate among the lexicographers. Several translators, working independently, had flagged certain lines of cuneiform. They were anomalous repetitions, disturbing phrases that defied context. hinting at a narrative layer they were not equipped, or perhaps not permitted, to comprehend. Their notes were cautious, academic, yet tinged with a palpable sense of dread. They had stumbled upon something that should not have been there. Within a matter of months, each of those scholars was abruptly reassigned. Their projects were handed to others, their access revoked. More unsettling still, their meticulous notes, the digital breadcrumbs leading back to their discovery, vanished from the official records. It was a modern echo of an ancient silence, a redaction performed with the sterile efficiency of a database query. In the world of academia, such an event would be cause for concern. But when viewed against the backdrop of the physical evidence, the deliberate physical destruction on the artifacts themselves, it became a demand for answers. A new team, operating under a mandate of secrecy, turned not to another human translator, but to a different kind of intelligence. They instructed a sophisticated neural network to perform a task of unprecedented scale, to search the aggregated global museum databases not for words, but for their absence. The AI was trained to identify the signature marks of erasure, the scraped strokes and gouged out patterns left by a stylus on wet clay thousands of years ago. It was a search for a fingerprint, a ghost in the ancient machine. What the algorithm returned was a chilling confirmation of their deepest suspicions. The same distinct removal marks, a unique signature of deliberate erasure, appeared on hundreds of tablets. These were not artifacts from a single location or a single dynasty. They were scattered across continents, housed in the collections of London, Berlin, and Baghdad. This was no isolated act of a rogue scribe, no simple correction of a mistake. This was evidence of a coordinated purge, a systematic effort carried out by ancient hands to permanently delete a specific thread from the tapestry of human history. The discovery of the crime led to the next logical and far more difficult step: reconstruction. The AI was retasked. It began to analyze the surrounding context of the voids, dissecting sentence structure, grammatical conventions, and the frequency of adjacent symbols. It learned the rhythm and cadence of the scribes, and then, using that knowledge, it began to predict what had been so violently scraped away. It was digital archaeology of the highest order, resurrecting lost words from the silence. As the missing sections were computationally restored, something remarkable occurred. Cuneiform fragments that had for centuries been cataloged as unrelated, a piece of a king's list here, a snippet of a harvest record there, suddenly snapped into focus. They were not disparate texts at all. The restored lines revealed a shared linguistic DNA, employing identical terminology and grammatical structures, all describing the same astonishing sequence of events. A single, unified narrative began to emerge from the noise of millennia, and it was here that the investigation crossed the threshold from history into something far stranger. The tablets did not describe a single origin for humanity. They detailed multiple engineered beginnings. According to the resurrected lines, humankind was not a singular creation, but a series of iterative projects. We were made, tested, and found wanting. We were rejected, rebuilt, and in certain cases, deemed failures and systematically erased from existence. As the team delved deeper, they found recurring references to the ME, a term from Sumerian lore designating a category of texts of immense power and danger. These were not mere stories, but the foundational principles of the cosmos, the divine blueprints the gods used to build and maintain order. The myths claim the god Enki guarded them with extreme prejudice, for in them lay the very secrets of creation and destruction. The AI located several of these ME fragments, hidden in plain sight within mislabeled digital archives. And on each one, the core lines, the operative verses, had been scraped away. When the analysis tool compared the erasure patterns on these sacred texts to those found on the tablets describing early human formation, it made a definitive connection. The tool marks were identical. The erasures had occurred within the same narrow historical window. The purge was organized, its targets carefully selected. The same hand that had scrubbed the history of our creation had also scrubbed the divine laws that governed it. The final breakthrough came when the AI was instructed to abandon the existing classifications and reorganize all the restored fragments into one seamless sequence. What emerged from the synthesis was not a myth or a history. It was a set of devastating instructions, a lab report. It spoke of prototypes, of failed models, of biological dead ends that were never meant to survive. The narrative was clinical, detailing the specific attributes and designated functions of each human variant. It echoed the chilling, pragma-performing agricultural labor. Yet this reconstructed text went further, speaking not just of labor, but of obsolescence and decommissioning. The story of humanity, it seemed, was not a linear ascent from the primordial ooze, but a curated narrative, edited with extreme prejudice by its own authors. We are the edition that survived, the version that was approved for publication. But the clay beneath our feet holds the memory of the drafts that were discarded, leaving us to forever question whether our history is an epic written by the gods or merely the final, sanitized draft of a failed experiment. Across the shattered remnants of Mesopotamia, a chilling taxonomy of life lay hidden in plain sight. It was not a classification of animals or plants, but of humanity itself, a blueprint for a workforce etched into clay millennia ago. One category, described as function-bearing life, speaks of beings brought into existence for a singular purpose: to serve their creators through unwavering obedience and the tireless execution of tasks. Another group, designated with the haunting label clay of lesser glow, appears to reference a caste engineered for grueling physical labor. The scribes who inscribed their fate distinguished them by a conspicuous absence of what they termed divine radiance, a quality reserved for a higher order of being. But it is the third classification that casts the longest shadow, a category known only as those who do not multiply. An artificial intelligence, tasked with deciphering these ancient echoes, identified this phrase with cold certainty. These were sterile prototypes, designed to serve a lifetime and then vanish, leaving no descendants to carry their legacy. This was not the isolated myth of a single city-state. The same precise terminology, the same unsettling classifications, surfaced again and again in the cuneiform fragments of the Akkadians and the grander tablets of the Babylonians. The evidence pointed to a shared foundational cosmology, a story of manufactured humanity that permeated the ancient Near East. For generations, our understanding of this story was anchored by the Atrahasis epic, where humanity was said to be sculpted from clay mixed with the blood of a god, a desperate measure to relieve the divine beings of their own cosmic labor. But the machine saw what human eyes, for over a century, had missed. The fragments describing this primordial act of creation were not whole. They were shards, separated by conquest and collection, scattered across the museums of the world. When the AI digitally reunited these long-lost siblings of clay, a new, more complex narrative blazed into view. The texts described not one mixture, but several. Different formulations were assigned to different groups, implying a deliberate, calculated variation, less a miracle of creation, and more the careful adjustment of a recipe, each one calibrated for a specific, predetermined function. This discovery peeled back the first layer of a far darker truth. Several tablets contained cryptic lines describing prototypes that were returned to the earth, cast into water, or broken before the naming. For decades, scholars had interpreted these passages as poetic, ritualistic language for burial rites or symbolic gestures. The AI, unburdened by tradition, flagged them as something else entirely. It recognized a pattern of chilling consistency, euphemisms repeated across disparate sites and historical periods. Its conclusion was stark. These were not rituals, but termination procedures for failed or unwanted models. Cross-referencing this language with a vast library of ancient texts, the system highlighted a Sumerian term, NIGGIG. Traditionally, the word was translated with a sense of mythic dread as thing of terror or abomination. Historians had long assumed it was a metaphor for monsters or cosmic evils. But the AI noticed its placement. NIGGIG appeared with unnerving frequency near descriptions of prototypes that were malformed, disobedient, or otherwise failed to meet their design specifications. The pattern suggested that NIGGIG was not a poetic flourish, but an official, technical classification. It was the ancient world's designation for an unacceptable outcome, a label for a flawed product on a celestial assembly line. This led to the first great historical shockwave. Re-examining the texts through this new lens, a radical idea emerged. Several fragments implied that the earliest humans did not perceive their creators as divine beings at all. The reverence, the worship, the spirituality we project onto the past may be a later invention. Instead, the tablets depict them as skilled supervisors, as master artisans or engineers who were physically present, actively managing the development of their creations. The Eridu Genesis describes humanity working day and night, not in prayer, but in production, to supply food, metals, and labor directly to these powerful entities. The relationship it paints is not spiritual, but transactional. The line between God and engineer, between worship and work, dissolves into the dust of ancient Iraq. We are left to confront a profound and unsettling question. If the foundation of human civilization was not an act of divine love, but a feat of biological engineering, then what are we? Are we the children of gods, or the enduring products of a forgotten cosmic industry? The echoes from the clay are no longer hymns of praise, but the time-worn ledgers of a cosmic transaction. In the shadowed annals of the deep past, long before recorded history, a narrative persists, one that strips humanity of its sacred origins. It is a story not of divine love, but of cosmic pragmatism. Echoing through ancient Iranian and Mesopotamian traditions is the unsettling idea that humankind was not born of a celestial plan, but forged as a tool, an instrument designed to solve a problem of celestial labor. These early models were obedient, their purpose defined by the tasks assigned. They were the perfect workforce. Yet, amid the legion of these compliant prototypes, a single anomaly emerged from the crucible of creation. A name whispered in fragmented cuneiform: Adapta. He was the forbidden upgrade, the ghost in the machine of existence, and the lost promise of eternal life. He was not merely an iteration, he was a singularity. Where his predecessors were bound to servitude, their roles limited to unthinking obedience, Adapta appeared in the textual fragments as a being of a different order altogether. So profoundly advanced that the ancient scribes struggled for a lexicon to contain him. In the Sumerian and Akkadian accounts, he is presented as the first wise human, fashioned directly by the hands of the creator god Enki. But this was only a fraction of the story. It was only when modern algorithms began the painstaking work of reconstructing the lost lines of the Eridu texts that the true, staggering nature of his design was revealed. The truth, when it surfaced, was a jolt to the system. Adapta was not simply improved, he was engineered to be dangerously superior. The tablets describe him as perfectly made, endowed with the speech of the heavens. Once dismissed as mythic poetry, this phrase now reads with the cold precision of a technical specification. It suggests a mind operating on a plane humans were never intended to reach. The reconstructed verses imply a cognitive architecture of impossible speed and clarity. Adapta could process information not just from the world around him, but from the very fabric of cosmic law. He comprehended the language of his creators, perceived the hidden mathematical structures underpinning reality, and demonstrated an intuitive insight that even his own maker had not fully anticipated. And this equation was overseen by Enlil. The cosmic administrator, the enforcer of order. Enlil's mandate was absolute: maintain the rigid hierarchy, enforce population limits, and ensure the human project remained within its designated path was not an achievement. It was a catastrophic breach of protocol. The fact that Enki had initiated this unauthorized upgrade in secret transformed a technical problem into an act of celestial rebellion, a direct challenge to the established power structure. As researchers cross-referenced this reconstructed narrative with the mythologies of the world, the parallels became too stark to ignore. Artificial intelligence flagged archetypal resonances, echoes of Adapta, in figures scattered across cultures and millennia. Prometheus, who stole fire, a form of divine technology, for humanity. The Egyptian Thoth, the scribe of the gods, keeper of esoteric knowledge. And most profoundly, Adam, the first man, who stood at a similar crossroads between obedience and enlightenment. Each story, in its own tongue, speaks of a pivotal figure tied to forbidden knowledge, the delicate balance of cosmic order, and the tragic loss of immortality. Yet, a peculiar pattern emerged from this comparative analysis. In each of these foundational myths, the critical moment of choice, the fulcrum upon which human destiny turns, is described with an almost unnerving brevity. The Adam story compresses the fateful act of eating the fruit into a single, stark passage. The Adapta narrative, for all its cosmic significance, chronicles his ultimate decision in just a few terse lines. It is as if the choice itself, the internal calculus of that moment, required no elaboration. The storytellers seem to suggest that the act was instantaneous, almost inevitable, while its consequences would demand millennia of explanation and regret. The reconstructed Sumerian lines guide us to the final act. Adapta, the perfect and flawed creation, ascends to the celestial realm. He is summoned to stand before Anu, the Sky Father, the ultimate authority. There, at the apex of existence, he is presented with an offer that would forever alter the trajectory of his kind: the bread of life and the water of life. These were not mere symbols. They were the keys to eternity, the divine gifts that would grant him and his descendants immortality, elevating them from temporary instruments to permanent beings. The choice laid before him was absolute. Remain immortal, a brilliant but fleeting experiment, or transcend the limits of his design and join the pantheon of the gods. The silence in the text at this moment is deafening. It forces us to confront the fundamental paradox of our own existence. Was the loss of paradise a punishment for disobedience? Or was it the first defiant act of a species choosing the profound, terrible, and beautiful burden of its own humanity? He ascends, a being of perfected clay and divine breath, summoned to the celestial court. Before him lies the ultimate offering, the food and water of everlasting life. But a warning had been whispered in his ear, a chilling instruction from his own creator, Enki. For generations, this was seen as an act of fatherly protection, a shield against some unknown poison in the heavens. But a new reading, pieced together from the digital ghosts of fractured tablets, reveals a colder truth. The warning was not a shield, it was a cage. Enki's instruction was never meant to save Adapta. It was meant to stop him. For if Adapta, the first upgraded prototype, a mind of unparalleled intelligence and reason, became immortal, it would expose a catastrophic vulnerability in the grand design. The architects of this world had no protocol, no final command for a being that could not die. An immortal subject who could learn, adapt, and inevitably surpass his makers was not a variable they could afford. Their entire system of management, the very architecture of control, was predicated on a single, brutal certainty: death. It was the ultimate reset button, the mechanism that wiped the slate clean, limited the accumulation of unsanctioned knowledge, and prevented the slow, creeping infection of rebellion. Mortality was not a bug. It was the system's most essential feature. If even one enhanced human, one perfect specimen, could escape that cycle, the delicate balance would not simply bend, it would shatter. The creators would lose their leverage, their final failsafe, forever. And so, Adapta obeyed. Standing at the threshold of eternity, he trusted his maker and refused the offering. He turned away from the one gift that could have liberated his kind from their engineered limits, unaware that his obedience was the very lock on the door. The restored lines are chillingly clear. They describe this moment not as a tragedy, but as a successful intervention. The closing of the gate. Another fragment confirms the cold calculus behind the act. The perfect one shall return to dust. The denial of immortality was not an accident of fate. It was a feature of the design. Adapta's refusal, born of misplaced faith, did more than just seal the fate of humanity. It sent a shockwave through the system, exposing every weakness in its foundation. The act enraged Enlil, the project's stern administrator, and ignited a conflict between the engineers, a schism so violent and fundamental it would trigger the first Great Reset. This was the beginning of the divine fracture. The moment Adapta's existence threatened the established order, the ancient narrative shifts. It descends into a darker chronicle, a slow-building war fought not with weapons of metal and fire, but with humanity itself as both the battleground and the prize. In the reconstructed histories, Enki and Enlil emerge not as gods, but as rival administrators with irreconcilable visions for their vast, unstable human engineering project. Enlil is the embodiment of order, of strict hierarchy and predictable outcomes. He demands controlled populations, behavior that adheres to the original programming. He is the guardian of the schematic. Enki, by contrast, is the rogue innovator. He represents experimentation, unauthorized upgrades, and a dangerous curiosity for bending rules that were never meant to be bent. He is the architect fascinated by the unintended consequences of his own creation. Humans, originally conceived as simple biological machines for labor, had been placed into a dynamic, real-world environment. And there, something began to happen that no one had planned for. Their minds began to adapt. Daily tasks meant to be rote demanded novel solutions. Social interaction, a byproduct of proximity, forged emotional depth and complex alliances. Repeated exposure to a world of unpredictable variables strengthened their capacity to learn, to remember, to anticipate. Each generation inherited these adaptations, amplifying them, refining them. Before the engineers could fully grasp the scale of the deviation, humans were thinking for themselves. They were forming communities, organizing resources, and creating intricate patterns of culture that no longer matched their baseline programming. They multiplied beyond their designated allotments. Their societies became, in the words of the texts, noisy. They began to act without instruction. Within the rigid framework of the creators, this was not seen as growth. It was a cascading error. It was a loss of control. Humanity, the perfect tool, had drifted into the uncharted territory of self-direction. The system's greatest error was not a flaw in the code. It was the emergence of a ghost in the machine, a will that refused to be contained. To regain control, the entire population had to be eliminated. The project had to be restarted, this time with a corrected design. Found repeated discussions of a reset that would scour the land clean, a destruction designed to wash away the noise. The system cross-referenced these terms against millions of contextual data points. The conclusion was unambiguous. The noise was the chaotic, unpredictable signal of human free will. The destruction was a direct and technical reference to a global, flood-based erasure protocol. On one particularly well-preserved tablet, the entity known as Enlil is recorded making a chilling declaration. The humans, it states, must be returned to clay. For centuries, this was interpreted by scholars as a poetic metaphor for death, a return to the earth from which they were made. But the system flagged the phrase with a high-priority alert. In the context of the surrounding text, returned to clay was not poetry. It was a technical term, a procedural command for mass termination. The narrative of a great flood, a story that haunts the memory of dozens of ancient cultures, began to read not as myth, but as a meticulously documented activation of a planetary failsafe. It was a procedure engineered to wipe out emergent complexity, to purge a biological experiment that had breached its operational parameters and now threatened the integrity of the entire system. But the logs of this global purge held a deeper, more unsettling anomaly. The role of the second entity, Enki, whose actions have long been celebrated as an act of rebellion, of compassion for his flawed creations. A closer examination of the data reveals a far more calculated motive. Deep within the code of a damaged tablet, the AI uncovered a forbidden line, a segment of text deliberately obscured. Save the lineage that obeys you. In that single, chilling phrase, Enki's true purpose became unmistakably clear. He did not defy the system's final command because he wished to protect all of humanity. He defied the purge because he sought to protect the specific humans shaped by his own unsanctioned modifications. It was not an act of mercy. It was an act of proprietary preservation. Suddenly, the world's ancient flood stories begin to align with a startling and terrifying clarity. The AI correlated the data streams. The great pralaya cycles of destruction described in the Hindu Vedas, the cyclical world-age collapses of the Mayan calendar, the legend of the four worlds of the Hopi, even Plato's detailed account of a sunken Atlantis. All of them, traditions separated by impassable oceans and millennia of time, point to the same type of event, a civilization-ending deluge. And they all place this catastrophe within the same broad prehistoric window. Each tradition claims that a world far more advanced than our own was wiped from the face of the earth thousands of years before the dawn of recorded history. When the AI compared the timelines extrapolated from these disparate accounts, the collapse periods overlapped within a 10% margin of error. That level of chronological agreement across cultures that could have had no possible contact with one another is a statistical impossibility. Unless they were not inventing myths. Unless they were all preserving the fragmented cultural memory of the same very real event. These were not symbolic stories of nature's wrath. They were the harmonized echoes of a single, coordinated purge that occurred when humanity evolved beyond the limits its creators had originally imposed. Yet buried inside these memories of a planetary reset were even more disturbing clues. Anomalies. Whispers of a technology so advanced, its very existence in the ancient world should not be possible. References to a forbidden science, artifacts of a power that belonged not to gods, but to engineers. As the AI finished organizing the restored fragments from the Sumerian archives, a pattern began to resolve from the noise. Phrases that generations of scholars had dismissed as poetic flourish, as primitive attempts to describe the dye with modern technical schematics. The clarity was impossible to ignore. The recurring image of wings of fire was no longer the poetic flight of a deity, but the unmistakable signature of controlled artificial aviation. The line describing metal bellies that roar ceased to be the hunger of a mythical beast and became the guttural, mechanical sound of an internal combustion engine. Another phrase, liquid metal that moves with thunder, resolved into a chillingly precise description of a volatile fuel, perhaps even a mercury-based propulsion system. The gods, it appeared, were not gods at all. They were technicians, and their heaven was not a celestial plane, but a world of technology beyond our comprehension. Our most sacred myths are not tales of creation, but the garbled memories of a laboratory. And the Great Flood was not a punishment for sin, but a simple, brutal act of decontamination, a reboot. It forces a final, terrifying question. If our history is merely the log file of a corrected program, how can we be certain the program is not still running? Among the chronicles of ancient warfare, etched into clay and stone, a description emerges that defies the logic of its time. Its were not the poetic descriptions of fire or sword, but something more akin to a directed, destructive beam of pure energy. And this chilling account was not confined to the river valleys of Mesopotamia. The same unsettling language, almost identical in its terrifying precision, was discovered in the annals of the Hittites, in the sacred Vedic hymns of India, and in the earliest known Persian texts. These were cultures separated by impassable mountains and unnavigable seas, speaking languages that shared no common root, yet they were all describing the same impossible tools of annihilation. The sheer consistency of the language became an undeniable signal. These were not independent flights of imagination, born from the superstitions of disparate peoples. They were eyewitness accounts, referencing a common technological inheritance, a source that existed long before their civilizations had risen, and long before such power should have ever appeared in the hands of humankind. As the data coalesced, another, more subtle pattern began to surface. It appeared as a series of sudden, inexplicable spikes in human knowledge. Across the archaeological and textual records, great leaps in metallurgy, astronomy, complex irrigation, and architectural precision would materialize as if from nowhere. These were not the slow, steady steps of gradual discovery. Instead, a burst of profound innovation would ignite within a specific region, lasting for a period of 30 to 50 years, and then cease as abruptly as it had begun. An entire society would be propelled by tenement of their newly built cities. When viewed across the grand tapestry of history, the pattern was unmistakable. Technology was not being discovered through trial and error. It was being distributed. This was a controlled release of information, selectively handed to specific human groups for a limited duration. Knowledge was not a river, flowing freely for all to drink. It was a carefully measured dose, administered only to populations deemed suitable or reliable for a given task. And once that task was complete, or once a civilization strayed from its intended path, the flow of information was severed. But the tablets also documented the consequences for those who sought to master technology they were not authorized to handle. Deep within a cuneiform cluster unearthed from the ruins of Nippur, one of the most chilling phrases ever reconstructed came to light. They lit the fire that was not theirs, and the mountains swallowed them. This was not a mythic turn of phrase. It was a final, stark warning, a historical record of a catastrophe. And it is a warning that finds a disturbing echo in the very soil of the earth. Across the region, several Bronze Age settlements bear the scars of vitrification. Here, ancient stone and mud brick surfaces were exposed to a heat so extreme they partially melted and fused, exceeding any campfire, burning city, or even a primitive forge. These sites reveal layers of loam, no signs of mass evacuation or gradual decline. There is only the silent, glassy stone. While archaeology cannot confirm the precise cause described in the tablets, the physical remains align perfectly with their terrifying message: that certain forms of knowledge were forbidden, and to wield them without sanction was to invite an unimaginable and absolute ruin. The record, written in both clay and fused stone, suggests that our ancestors lived in the shadow of a power they could borrow, but never truly possess. It forces us to confront the idea that not all discovery is progress, and that some doors, once opened, can never be closed again. As the artificial mind sifted through the digital ghosts of our past, aligning technological milestones with the silent testimony of archaeological strata, a disquieting symmetry began to emerge. The long, slow climb of human innovation was not a steady, natural ascent. It was a series of punctuated leaps, deliberate and selective, as if a hidden hand were guiding our species, preparing it for a singular, predetermined event. Appeared on Sumerian tablets, was etched into Babylonian records, and whispered in Akkadian hymns. And in that recurring phoneme, the machine discovered a warning, a message of such profound consequence that the ancient scribes had seemingly tried to bury it within their own histories. The term was Nibiru. For generations, the name has echoed in the fringes of scholarship, a byword for a hypothetical planet, a rogue world lurking in the dark frontiers of our solar system. When researchers directed the analysis toward every known reference to this celestial enigma, everything they thought they knew was fractured. The machine proved the popular assumption catastrophically wrong. Across the entire corpus of Mesopotamian literature, Sumerian, Babylonian, Akkadian, and Assyrian, Nibiru was never described as a physical place. It was a description of a recurring apocalypse, a cosmic cycle that periodically and violently rewrites the sky and the world below. The reconstructed translations, stripped of centuries of misinterpretation, were painfully clear. The scribes gave it epithets of terror: the one who veils the light, the great destroyer, the crossing. These are not the names of a world. They are the titles of a recurring disaster, a phenomenon that consumes the sky, silences the sun, and fractures the very ground beneath their feet. Nibiru was not a place. Nibiru was a reckoning. The system then cast its net wider, comparing the Sumerian descriptions of this cataclysm with astronomical and geological records from other ancient cultures. Once the timelines were aligned, the pattern became impossible to dismiss. Civilizations separated by thousands of miles, by impassable deserts and unsailed seas. Cultures who spoke in tongues alien to one another and who never met had all documented the same sky-breaking terror. In Babylon, cuneiform records, etched into clay by astronomer priests, described distinct periods where constellations would suddenly dim, or entire sections of the night sky would vanish from view for days at a time. These were not myths or religious allegories. They were dispassionate, empirical reports, complete with dates and celestial coordinates. Their records spoke of a sweeping shadow and of the heavens trembling, phrasing that directly mirrors the Sumerian descriptions of the crossing. Meanwhile, along the fertile banks of the Nile, Egyptian priest astronomers, keepers of meticulous calendars and star charts, logged what they called dark epochs. These were specific, dreaded periods when the sun appeared to weaken, when shadows stretched and warped in unnatural ways, and the very quality of the air seemed to shift. Crucially, these celestial anomalies were not logged in times of peace. They were the chilling backdrops to dynastic collapse, to societal fragmentation, and to the desperate, arduous process of rebuilding. The exact historical pattern one would expect if a recurring cosmic event repeatedly destabilized entire civilizations. The evidence points not to a single event in the distant past, but to a rhythm of destruction, a celestial clockwork that has governed human history from the shadows. Our greatest leaps forward seem to coincide with the periods just before this crossing, and our darkest ages with the times just after. We may not be the authors of our own story, but merely characters, living out a chapter that has been written and rewritten countless times before. Within the ancient Vedic scriptures of India, the great cycles of time, the yugas, are not marked by gradual change. Their transitions are foretold by sudden, violent cosmic disturbances. The texts speak of a moment when the sky turns upon itself, a phrase long considered poetic metaphor. But a new intelligence, examining these words with digital precision, identified a chilling correlation. Another cultural attempt to describe a vast astronomical upheaval. The very same celestial event the Sumerians called Nibiru. Far across the globe, among the Hopi people of the American Southwest, a similar prophecy endures. Their purification time is not a spiritual cleansing, but a physical resetting of the world. Their oral traditions describe the sky darkening, the earth shaking with unimaginable force, and entire settlements vanishing as if they had never been. Their prophecy states without ambiguity that the world has been remade multiple times, with each previous age ending under these eerily familiar conditions of celestial chaos and terrestrial ruin. When these disparate traditions are laid side by side, a profound pattern emerges. Countless ancient cultures, separated by oceans and millennia, shared a core belief that our world moves through repeating epochs of yet these cycles are not identical. In the Hindu cosmology, the yugas last for immense spans, stretching into millions of years, far beyond the reach of recorded history. For the Hopi, these world-altering events are enshrined in sacred stories, not filed away in dated historical records. The Babylonians, meanwhile, based their cycles on meticulous astronomical observations, charting patterns that repeat over years or decades. Each system was born in a different land, in a different era, for a different purpose. They do not describe one shared, singular catastrophe. Instead, they reveal a universal human intuition, the deep-seated awareness that civilization is fragile, that our world can break down, and that it must then begin again. It was from the Sumerian tablets that the most disturbing message was recovered. An artificial intelligence, tasked with reconstructing damaged cuneiform, uncovered a warning that ancient scribes had deliberately tried to erase, scraping the clay to obscure the words perhaps to prevent panic or to keep a terrible power from being misused. The restored passage was a stark pronouncement. When the crossing comes, memory shall fall. The old world shall be unmade, and the new shall not remember the old. The context surrounding the line makes its meaning painfully clear. Memory shall fall is not the loss of individual recollection. It is the systematic collapse of knowledge itself. Libraries turned to ash, scientific understanding lost, entire languages disappearing into silence. The old world shall be unmade reflects the physical annihilation of civilization. Cities crumbling to dust, populations decimated, the complex machinery of political systems grinding to a permanent halt. But the final line is the most terrifying. The new shall not remember the old. This describes the fate of the survivors, a species thrown back into a primitive state, forced to rebuild society from scratch, with no awareness that advanced civilizations, perhaps greater than their own, had existed before them. An enforced planetary amnesia. The AI then mapped these ancient predictions against millennia of archaeological and geological data. The results were unnerving. Every time the Sumerian cycles predicted a crossing, the global record showed evidence of sudden cultural collapse, unexplained mass migrations, abrupt breaks in technological progress, and the inexplicable disappearance of entire civilizations. The patterns lined up across thousands of years with a frightening mathematical precision. Destroys civilizations was not a one-time occurrence. It is a recurring phenomenon. And according to the celestial cycle they so carefully documented, we have now entered the exact window for its return. We may be living in the twilight of a world, blissfully unaware of the history that is doomed to repeat itself.